The Duc de Feltre was much agitated. It was easy to perceive that he was seeking for those turns of phrase and expressions which could best express his attachment to the emperor, whilst he was in the presence of the empress, before whom, however, he felt no hesitation in being of an opposite opinion to the rest of the council. Nevertheless, his speech did not remain unanswered. A reply was given to the different pictures he had drawn, and notwithstanding the tone of assurance he had assumed, the council, whose votes were again taken on the subject, was of opinion that the empress should remain in Paris. This question was carried by as many votes as the preceding one. Prince Joseph was for a retreat, but there was no difficulty in discovering that he opposed the resolution, not so much because he disapproved of it, as in order to acquire certainty that every member of the council had spoken his candid opinion. Being compelled at last to vote in his turn, he sided with the Minister of War and exhibited a letter from the emperor, who he had informed him that, owing to the difficulties of keeping up the communications, he could not point out what it might be proper to do in case of any unexpected occurrence. He, Prince Joseph, ought therefore to be guided by circumstances, but there could not happen a greater misfortune than that the King of Rome should fall into the enemy's power. Should there be any grounds for apprehending such a danger, he desired him in the most unequivocal manner to send off the empress and his son to Rambouillet, and from thence to Tours. The emperor's letter farther stated, I believe that it would be treasonable to expose the King of Rome to the danger of falling into the enemy's hands. The communication of this letter was a severe blow to the members of the council, and explained the opinion expressed by the Duc de Feltre, who was no doubt acquainted with it, for he had long urged the emperor to issue instructions in case of the event with which we were now threatened. It must be owned that the emperor could not issue any order more suited to the views of those who are willing enough to reap the honors attached to their situation, provided they are not called upon to share its dangers. Notwithstanding the intention so formally manifested in the emperor's letter, the council adhered to its opinion. The Duc de Cador even proposed that, dismissing its contents from their consideration, they should detain the empress in Paris. It was unanimously agreed that if the point under discussion were to be decided by the vote of the members of the council, neither the empress nor the government should quit the capital, but that if it were intended to carry the emperor's order into effect, it was useless to call them together, as it ought not to have been supposed that they intended to disobey the emperor. Behooved those persons to whom he had delegated his power to consider whether the moment had arrived which he had fixed upon for the removal of the government from Paris. M. de Talleyrand again observed that all was lost if Paris were abandoned. On a third scrutiny, however, it was decided that since there existed an order from the emperor, it ought to be complied with. However likely to prove injurious to his cause, the Arch-Chancellor, after having collected all the votes, also agreed in the propriety of the departure, and announced that Her Majesty and her son should set out at 8 o'clock the next morning for Rambouillet. As soon as this determination was adopted, each of the ministers demanded instructions for conducting his department of the service, and it was agreed, first, that Prince Joseph should remain in Paris, and the Arch-Chancellor alone should accompany the Empress and the King of Rome. Secondly, that the other dignitaries and the ministers were also to remain in Paris until Prince Joseph should give his orders for their departure, which, to obviate any mistake, would be signified to each by Monsieur Molay, the High Judge. Thirdly, it was agreed that the President of the Senate should accompany the Empress, previously to which he was to caution all the members of that body against attending any summons to assemble which had not the stamp of legality, or, in other words, which might be deficient in the forms prescribed by the constitutions of the empire. These points having been determined upon, the sitting broke up. At the hour of 2 in the morning, the members composing the council met in the adjoining apartment and deplored the resolution which just had been adopted. Many addressed me in these words: if I were Minister of Police, Paris should be in a state of insurrection tomorrow, and the Empress should not be allowed to depart. The inhabitants of Paris were no doubt well inclined to rise. I had long discovered that nothing was easier than to set it in motion, a course which wholly depended upon myself. Which of you, I said to them, would take the responsibility of the events that might be the consequence of such a movement, especially after what you have just witnessed? And after your having decided the emperor's orders should be obeyed, you advise me to take upon myself what you have been apprehensive of attempting. How am I to know the emperor's intentions and whether such a movement might not interfere with them? Should I fail of success, what purpose would have been answered by the massacre, the plunder, and the many other evils consequent upon an appeal to the mass of the people? Is it certain? Is it even probable that the sovereign who refused to protect his retreat by the burning of Leipzig would desire to reign at the expense of the misfortune in which a similar determination might involve the capital? What answer could I ever give to his reproaches? What could I urge against the complaints of 100,000 families, which would call me to an account for the loss of their chiefs, their dwellings, and their fortunes? How could I ever consent to make so many victims, or cause such bitter tears? I cannot take upon myself to plunge a whole population into an abyss of misery. Independently of this consideration, had I the resolution to act in such a manner, the spirit of my instruction forbids me. Far from requiring that I should compromise the safety of the inhabitants, the emperor has desired me to quit Paris. If the allies should enter it, I might certainly prevent the departure of the empress, but none but a madman could presume to master the events which might follow such an act of violence. In endeavoring to serve the emperor, I might destroy his remaining chance of success and turn to the advantage of a party whatever hopes he may still indulge in. The case might be otherwise if I had no orders to obey, and if it came suddenly upon me. But everything has been foreseen. I must only conform. Like the rest, I deplore with them the fatal resolution just adopted. But I will not take upon my individual responsibility what you have not dared to do in your collective capacity. I had more than one motive for resisting the advice given to me. They were as follows. I had long since discovered that the emperor, though fully persuaded of my attachment to his person, had not been wholly inaccessible to the insinuations thrown out in respect to me. It was represented that I did not attend to business, that I was led by the persons employed under my orders, that I was the sport of intrigues, that with the best possible intentions I was not adequate to the situation of Minister of Police, and was a perfect stranger to the Revolution, a deep knowledge of which was required for the proper discharge of the duties of that office. The party who had been foiled by my appointment to the ministry had not lost the hope of procuring my removal and substituting one of its own members, as it had done for the last 15 years. In respect to every other branch of the administration, I could not disguise from myself on the occasion of the affair, the 23rd of October, that if I was not then sacrificed by the emperor to the calumnious imputations of the Minister of War, it was owing to the circumstances of his being so fully convinced in the baseness of the reports transmitted to him as to be under the necessity of acknowledging that no blame attached to me in the business. But as he had at first given a kind of sanction to what had been related to him, he was unwilling to retrace his steps at once. The Minister of War had made himself conspicuous in the intrigues of the Revolution. Some associates and friends of that period had rallied round him, and they jointly exerted every possible means of procuring the appointment of a person to succeed me. I saw and was told everything. I had no doubt of the fact of these intrigues, and only proved myself the more faithful in the discharge of my duties. I had, however, renounced all farther reliance upon the effects of the emperor's former kindness for me when I acted as his aide-de-camp. I was even fully satisfied that he would call me to a more strict account than anyone else. Not that he had entirely dismissed me from his regard, but because he had been made to believe that I was inclined to boast of possessing his esteem in a more especial degree, and often allowed myself a latitude of action upon the conviction that I might do anything with impunity. Since his journey to Holland, during which the Queen of Naples came to Paris, and especially since his return from Russia, I had opportunities of discovering that I had fallen off in his good opinion. I accordingly became more reserved and constantly felt the uneasiness of a man who is considered to be out of his place and is compelled to seek consolation within himself for the injustice done to him. I regretted having left the military profession, and yet felt a degree of aversion for those perpetual wars which had grown into a habit, instead of presenting the same career of glory as in the early period of the emperor's reign. Such being my position, aware, as I have said, of all the intrigues directed against me, I had everything to fear in opposing the Minister of War. he would in fact have infallibly thrown upon me the whole responsibility of the attempt, and in order to be consistent with himself, and place his responsibility under shelter, whilst he yielded at the same time to an impulse inherent in the human breast, he would not have failed to divulge to the troops the meditated scheme. The generals in command would have instantly deserted me, and I should then have appeared in no other light than as the leader of a factious band, for the head of a party, in a moment of danger, possesses no influence when abandoned by the soldiery. It is likely that Marshals Marmont and Mortier, being previously put upon their guard by the Minister of War, would have ventured to take part in an insurrection in which they could not have been the principal actors, when, on the other hand, they protected their responsibility by following the direction given by the Minister of War. What would then have been the composition of my party? It would have consisted of men who had just admitted the necessity of obeying the order exhibited by the Prince Joseph to the council. They would have infallibly abandoned me, the more so as they clearly saw that the emperor's order had only been given on the remonstrances and repeated entreaties of the Minister of War. Admitting for a moment the supposition that I should have set in motion the class of people commonly called the men of the Republic, what were the means at my command for checking any disorderly conduct? Such a party, therefore, would have been at least as dangerous to the emperor as his foreign enemies. Having no previous instructions by which to direct my conduct, I incurred the risk of falling a victim to that party as soon as it should have been formed. What would not have been said had manners taken this turn, as might indeed have been the case? I should have been covered with ridicule. For the allies, who only aimed at the emperor's downfall, might easily have come to an understanding with a party to whom they would have dictated whatever terms they thought proper, not accepting the surrender of the empress and her son into their hands. They would no sooner have treated upon a counteracting basis than they would have immediately obtained the ascendancy, and by promising to spare the capital, they would have secured the acceptance of all their proposals. A consideration of the times and of the then existing circumstances cannot fail to add weight to these remarks. The experience I had acquired of mankind had sufficiently satisfied me of the correctness of that opinion to prevent my placing any reliance upon the outward demonstration displayed by those who had not a spark of that courage which the course they proposed to me would necessarily call for. I accordingly determined to obey and follow the opinion given by the council. From that moment, I no longer considered myself in any other capacity than I was vested with the duty of maintaining the public tranquility. On quitting the palace of the Tuileries, Monsieur de Talleyrand came up and addressed me in these words. "Well," said he, "thus ends all this business. Are you not also of the opinion of the council? It must be owned we are losing the game. With fine cards in our hands, such is the consequence of the folly of some ignorant men who persevere in exercising from day to day a fatal influence. The emperor is really much to be pitied, and yet this will not be the case, for he is very unreasonable in so obstinately confiding in the people who beset him. It is a mere act of weakness, which is quite unaccountable in such a man. Consider, sir, what a downfall for the pages of history to record. He should have given his name to the age he lives in, instead of which it will only stand conspicuous in the catalogue of adventurers. I am deeply mortified at the bare idea. What course are we now to adopt? It is not the duty of everyone to remain under this edifice now crumbling to ruins. However, we shall see what will happen. The emperor would have done much better to spare me his insults, and to form a more correct estimate of those who instilled prejudices in his mind. He would have discovered that such friends as the latter are much more to be dreaded than open enemies. What would he have said of anyone else who might have involved himself in the like difficulties? He added many other observations which were but a repetition of the former ones, and we parted. there was hardly a member of the council who, on quitting the Tuileries, did not take an affectionate leave of his companion. So well satisfied was everyone that the meeting, just broken up, was the last act of the government in which they were connected. Book 4, Part 1. The preparations for the departure were completed by 7 o'clock the next morning. The report of the approaching departure of the Empress soon got into circulation. The people hurried in crowds to the palace, and the Place du Carrousel was soon filled with a multitude of men and women anxious to cut the traces from the carriage, to send away the horses, and to behold the regent generously running with them the last chances of fortune. So great, however, was the respect still borne to her person and her wishes, that notwithstanding the immense crowd of people who were all desirous of preventing her departure, not the slightest manifestation was given of such an intention. The least effort on our part would nevertheless have saved our cause, as the Empress was far from approving the resolution adopted. Prince Joseph and the Arch-Chancellor equally disapproved of it, and had given it the support of their votes merely in consequence of the Emperor's positive orders. But neither the one nor the other mistaken as to the infallible effect of that resolution. Such was also the impression upon Maria Louisa's mind. All saw what ought to be done, but none dared to issue the requisite orders. Joseph proposed to the Empress that she should take the lead. The Empress referred to the Council of Regency, saying that the Emperor had appointed it as the guide of her actions, that it behooved its members to trace out the conduct she should pursue, and that on no account should she presume to oppose the Emperor's will. Joseph then observed that previously to quitting the capital, it was proper at least to ascertain the numerical amount of the forces which threatened it, and he accordingly started at the break of day to satisfy himself on the subject. The Empress was desirous to wait his return, as agreed upon between them, previously to adopting any determination. But the most alarming intelligence, the most contradictory reports succeeded each other at every moment. She yielded to the urgent entreaties of the Minister of War, and at the hour of 11 in the morning she stepped into her carriage. The Empress was attended by those whom she had specially named to accompany her, and took her departure under her usual escort of guards. The assembled crowds testified every mark of interest in her fate at this painful moment, but if anyone had been bold enough to cut the traces from the horses, there would have been an end of all further responsibility. All hesitation would have disappeared, and the capital would have been saved. It was a remarkable fact that the King of Rome evinced the utmost resistance at the moment of his being taken by his mother. The child cried out that his papa was betrayed, and he was determined not to go. He grasped at the curtains of the apartment, saying that he was in his own house and would not quit it. Nothing but the ascendancy of Madame de Montesquieu could calm him, and she only succeeded in persuading him that he should allow himself to be taken to his mother, by faithfully promising to bring him back. After the departure of the Empress, the power fell into the hands of Prince Joseph, who quitted the Luxembourg, where he resided, and came to establish himself at the Tuileries. He endeavored to protract the defense and to take advantage of the few resources remaining to us, only showing himself indifferent to what was not for the good of the Emperor's service. For it must be acknowledged that a spirit of intrigue was at work about his person, even previously to the breaking off of the armistice of Lusigny. Some slight attempt had been made to persuade him that he should declare himself protector of the Empire and cause the Senate to pronounce the Emperor's forfeiture to the throne. The leaders in this plot were very nearly the same men who a fortnight afterwards exerted themselves to procure the recall of the House of Bourbon, with which they had either felt a repugnance to connect themselves or had not as yet any settled intercourse. Prince Joseph not only repelled the insinuation, but he demonstrated to those who had thrown it out how great was the danger of an attempt, at least consequence of which would be to destroy the few resources still remaining to the Emperor, whose shadow still protected us. Such an attempt might even be the occasion of a civil war and bring Frenchmen into open contact with each other. And at any rate, whatever might be the chance of success, no mistake could be greater than that of supposing him capable of taking part with his brother's enemies. He added that he was willing to forget the proposal thus made to him, provided it was never mentioned again, nor followed up. Otherwise, he would cause proceedings to be instituted against the authors of it. The Prince of Benevento remained in Paris with the arch-treasurer and the ministers. The moment was drawing near when this lengthened state of agony was to terminate. The departure of the empress could not be kept a secret from the enemy, who were at the gates of the capital. It was also the signal for a countless number of private departures, which had been postponed until that occurrence, so that the road from Paris to Chartres presented an immense line of carriages in every description. None but the beholder of such a sight can form an adequate idea of it. Let the reader picture to himself the confusion attendant upon such a scene of distress, and he will then feel less difficulty in accounting to himself for the consequences which followed in its train. The southern part of Paris was completely deserted, and the whole population of the environs flocked towards the north of the capital. Nevertheless, the enemy, who had on the preceding days driven before it on the road to Meaux, had small corps under the orders of General Campan, had just forced it back a second time to the immediate vicinity of the gate of Bondy, between the pond of La Villette and the heights of Ménilmontant. The allied sovereigns were in person on the spot. On the other hand, the corps of Marshal Marmont and Mortier, having been summoned to the relief of the capital, had reached Saint-Mandé on the night previous to the attack. They immediately took up their positions in order of battle. Marmont had his right leaning upon the river Marne, and had spread Mortier's troops on his left under the heights of Montmartre. He had the command of both corps, had caused Romainville to be reconnoitered, and from the reports brought to him was under the impression that the Allies had not made their appearance. He accordingly marched upon the village, where, however, the Russians were strongly posted. The action began and soon became warmly contested. The Duke of Padua, who led the right, could not maintain his ground, having been compelled to quit the field in consequence of a musket shot received in the midst of the action. He was replaced by General Lussault, who retreated to the burial ground of Père Lachaise for the purpose of restoring order in his ranks. This retrograde movement completely uncovered the road from Belleville to Saint-Mandé. The Duke of Ragusa was compelled to abandon the attack of Romainville and to hasten back to protect the former village. It was high time he should do so, for General Campan had retreated from the position which he occupied in the basin of La Villette. The Russians, who were no longer kept in check by our troops, had moved forward and were already debouching upon his right, whilst the Duke of Ragusa was still in ignorance of the retreat of his subordinate officer. Nevertheless, he stood his ground and succeeded in carrying his movement into effect. Whilst these events were taking place, Paris was witness to a scene which redounds to the shame of those in whom it originated. The National Guard had been for upwards of a month urging the necessity of its being provided with muskets, instead of those ridiculous pikes with which the greater part had been furnished for their only weapons. They had often repeated the demand without ever being attended to. I wrote to the Emperor on this subject, and he replied in these words: "You make a foolish request. The arsenal is full of muskets. They must be made available." I had exhibited this letter to Prince Joseph and to the Minister of War. The reply of the latter was that he had but very few muskets at command, and he preserved them for the army, which stood in constant need of them. I was therefore unable to obtain any. It was only at the moment of the attack made upon the troops posted under the walls of Paris that the Duke of Feltre consented to deliver up to the National Guard 4,000 muskets instead of 20,000, which they were in want of, and to complete the mischief. These 4,000 muskets were only distributed when the different legions were already assembled. The cars loaded with these arms were brought before them, and they were immediately distributed. It was only during the preceding night that the Ordnance Department had received directions to deliver up the muskets, but at that time the fate of Paris was no longer doubtful. The Minister of War was foremost in declaring that he considered the capital as lost. Why then did he not open the arsenals to the populace at that moment and give up their contents to it, since there existed no other means of preventing their falling into the enemy's hands? Prince Joseph had established himself at Montmartre at the break of day and had summoned the members of the Council of Defense to join him. I was one of the first to attend the summons. The drums were beating in all directions about Paris. The citizens assembled. The suburbs displayed the most unbounded patriotism. I was much surprised on reaching Montmartre not to find the least preparation for a defense. 2 or 3 field pieces had been mounted on the heights, whilst there were upwards of 200 disposable ones at the Champ de Mars, which might have been transported to any point of Paris by means of the carriage horses, that capital. The Minister of War had only to say the word, but he remained silent. No preparations were made for a defense. The very platforms were not even drawn, nor any esplanade raised for the purpose of erecting a battery of cannon. Montmartre was, moreover, destitute of troops, and the National Guards were under the necessity of occupying it. At no time could their presence have been rendered so available as at the moment of their receiving the 4,000 muskets, which had so much difficulty being wrung from the arsenals. The enemy, whose plan of attack was already agreed upon, had developed all the resources at their command. They were rapidly gaining ground on the heights of Belleville and Menilmontant, where it had been found impossible to oppose to them a fourth part of the troops which they had deployed in that direction. The members who were to compose the Council of Defense had not yet arrived. Prince Joseph prevailed upon me to ascertain in person what was going forward at the point where the contest appeared to be most severely carried on, and to bring back an account of my observations. I proceeded to the spot along the outside of the wall of enclosure. Our troops were already beginning to give way. Nevertheless, they were courageously fought every inch of ground, a courage the more praiseworthy as the contest could not be attended with any favorable result. The occurrence of another accident greatly increased the danger of their position. The 2 marshals were under the necessity of repairing to the Council of Defense, and whilst on their way from the heights of Menilmontant to the heights of Montmartre, the enemy, who were already in such overwhelming numbers, had the farther advantage of being no longer opposed to those who were personally entrusted with command. The council was composed of the Minister of War, of the 2 marshals, of the Commandant of Paris, and of a few other general officers. They received at every moment the most disastrous intelligence and saw from their point of meeting the enemy's troops covering the plain between Saint-Denis and the capital. Nevertheless, the heads of the respective corps who had returned to their posts imparted to the defense a character of enthusiasm which had for some time the effect of overawing the Allies. The latter, however, were constantly receiving fresh reinforcements, and the sun had not yet performed 2/3 of its course. A more protracted resistance was no longer deemed possible. Marmont communicated this painful state of affairs to Prince Joseph, who replied to him by a note couched in the following terms: Paris, the 30th of March, 1814. If the Marshal Duke of Treviso and the Marshal Duke of Ragusa can no longer maintain their positions, they are authorized to open a conference with the Prince Schwarzenberg and with the Emperor of Russia, who are in front of them. Joseph, Montmartre, a 12:15 at noon. They will retreat towards the Loire. Marmont immediately opened a communication with the enemy. His flags of truce were greeted with a volley of musketry on the high road of Belleville, but obtained a more friendly reception in the direction of La Villette. They were admitted to a hearing, announced that the marshal was authorized to treat, and demanded a suspension of arms, which was immediately granted. During the occurrence of these events at Belleville, General Dijon arrived in Paris with dispatches from the Emperor. This prince was in the environs of Arcis-sur-Aube when he learned that the march of the Allies was upon the capital. He immediately foresaw the fatal consequences which were likely to result from this movement, and instructed General Gourgaud to proceed in all haste and take possession of the bridges. At Troyes, a dispatch from that town, a courier to announce to the Minister of War that the army was hastening to relieve the capital. Colonel Gourgaud had no sooner reached Troyes than he was overtaken by General Dijon, who was dispatched direct to Paris. The post house had no relays of horses. Gourgaud gave up the one he had succeeded in obtaining, and Dijon proceeded on his way. He arrived at the moment when the action was most briskly contested, alighted at his father's house, mounted another horse, and hurried off in all speed to Montmartre. Prince Joseph was just gone. He hastened after the prince, overtook him in the middle of the Bois de Boulogne, handed over the emperor's dispatches, and urged him to return to Paris. The prince refused, saying that it was too late, that he had authorized the marshals to treat. He, however, prevailed upon the general to repair to the marshals and make known to them the order of which he was the bearer. Dijon accordingly overtook Marshal Mortier, who was fighting near the canal of La Villette, and communicated the instructions confided to him. Fresh overtures had been made. The Allies, or Austria at least, appeared disposed to listen to them. Both parties were on the point of coming to an agreement. It was of the utmost importance to obtain at any price the delay of a few hours and save the capital from the evils of a hostile occupation. The Duke of Treviso quickly adopted this idea. He called for a drum, and in the midst of the grape shot which was decimating his squares, he wrote the following letter under the walls of Paris, the 30th of March, 1814. To His Serene Highness Prince Schwarzenberg, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Armies. Prince, negotiations have been again opened. The Duke of Vicenza has taken his departure with the intention of repairing to the presence of His Majesty, the Emperor of Austria. Prince Metternich must be at this time with the Emperor Napoleon in this state of things, and at a moment when matters may be amicably arranged. It behooves us, Prince, to spare the effusion of blood. I am sufficiently authorized to propose arrangements. They are such as to claim attention. Accordingly, Prince, I do myself the honor to propose a suspension of arms for 24 hours, during which we might treat of terms in order to save from the horrors of besiege the city of Paris, in which we are determined to defend ourselves to the last extremity. I request your Serene Highness will accept the assurance of my distinguished consideration, and I avail myself of this opportunity to renew the expression of the sentiments, personal esteem I entertain towards you. The Marshal Duke of Treviso. The Duke of Treviso had scarcely dispatched his letter when one of the Duke of Ragusa's officers came to inform him of the convention entered into by this marshal. The step he was taking necessarily became superfluous from that moment. He justly foresaw that the intelligence transmitted by him to the Generalissimo of the Allies would be considered as a lure held out for the purpose of gaining time. Such indeed was the fact. Schwarzenberg was not satisfied with expressing a doubt of the overtures alluded to by Marshal Mortier. He even contested the possibility of an amicable understanding, and yet the negotiation announced by the Marshal were by no means imaginary. Indignant at finding that his negotiation had failed in the object of concluding any terms, the emperor had adopted the determination of being his own diplomatist and of opening a direct communication with the Emperor of Austria. In the night of the 25th to the 26th of March, he had sent for Colonel Galbois, entrusted him with dispatches for that prince, and after particularly enjoining that he should avoid the Russians and parley with none but the troops of the sovereign, to whose presence he was repairing, he had said to him, "Proceed in all haste, you are the bearer of peace." The colonel succeeded in escaping the Cossacks, but was unable to penetrate as far as Dijon. Nevertheless, he met with a most friendly reception and obtained on the morning of the 28th the assurance that the proposals he had transmitted were accepted. An adjutant of the Emperor of Austria, who came to communicate to him the intentions of that prince, stated that each of the three principal sovereigns was authorized to treat and to affix his signature to the name of the other two, that peace was made not with Austria alone but with the whole coalition. The colonel pressed for a written answer, but the drawing up of a document of so much importance required time, and the smallest delay might again place everything at hazard. He took his departure upon the repeated assurance that the written document should be immediately dispatched. This was actually done, but a party of Cossacks fell upon the flags of truce, who were the bearers of it. Both Frenchmen and Austrians were carried off, and the enterprise meditated against Paris was more actively followed up after this occurrence. It was no doubt unknown to Schwarzenberg, since instead of admitting the overtures of the Duke of Treviso, he replied to him by transmitting an odious document, to which I shall presently have occasion to revert. Matters remained in the state in which they had been left. It never occurred either to Dijon or to Mortier to inform Marmont of the proximate arrival of the emperor, in order that he might avail himself of the delay occasioned by a suspension of arms and make another effort to maintain his ground until nightfall. The two marshals quietly met at the gate of La Villette, where they agreed with Mr. Nesselrode and Count Orloff upon the terms of capitulation, which were signed by Colonel Favary and Colonel Saint-Denis. the one an officer of the staff, the other the first aide-de-camp of the Duke of Ragusa. Thus terminated that deplorable business, and the fate of France was thenceforward decided. Nevertheless, the emperor had only asked of Paris that it should defend itself for 4 or 5 days. He had announced on quitting the capital the possibility that in consequence of the maneuvers he was under the necessity of adopting, the enemy might come close up to the walls of that immense city, but he would lose no time in hastening to his rescue. A promise had been made to them that no alarm should be felt at the enemy's approach, but this assurance was not borne out by the fact. Paris is no doubt free from reproach. All the citizens were ready to follow any leader, and if instead of leaving in the arsenals and in the Champ de Mars the arms and artillery which were found there by the enemy, they had been given up to the population of Paris some few days sooner, they assuredly would have turned them to a better account. An error of so grave a nature ought only to be laid to the charge of those narrow-minded men who, thirsting for favors and for power, had by dint of cringing and of protestations of fidelity succeeded in securing to themselves the exclusive confidence of their chief. These were the men who sealed our fate by their want of courage in moments of peril, whilst Prince Joseph was prevailed upon to adopt the fatal resolution which I have just adverted to. The ministers and all those who formed the active part of the government were still in Paris. It was no doubt greatly regretted at this time that Paris was not in a state of insurrection, but there only remained a few hours for distributing arms, disposed of the numerous artillery in the Champ de Mars, raising up the street pavements, and in general for assuming the attitude of a city determined to defend itself. All this might have been effected a few days sooner. But when the citizens of Paris found that greater reliance was placed upon the enemy than upon themselves for preserving the capital, it was natural for them to entertain a poor opinion of those whose care their fate had been committed. All met one another with a feeling of intense anxiety. All inquired what would be the end of such a state of things. I was still upon the heights of Belleville when the Council of Defense, which was held at Montmartre, came to its final determination. I proceeded to the gates of Saint-Antoine, went over the suburbs, which was prepared to obey any order except that of surrender. All were clamorous for arms. An army might have been raised of those men who entertained such sentiments. As I was ascending the boulevard of Saint-Antoine to repair a second time to the gate, I met a clash with the Duc d'Alberg, who was returning from the interior of the suburb. I asked him from whence he came and found him extremely agitated. I was greatly surprised at meeting him and reflected for a moment on the circumstances, being still ignorant of the resolution just adopted at Montmartre. It was easy for me to have made him pay the forfeit of his intrigues, but the game was lost. A public execution would have answered no purpose, and I allowed him to proceed on his way. From the gate of Saint-Antoine, I returned to Montmartre. There was still a free passage along the outer boulevard, but the enemy were at no great distance from it. On arriving at the foot of the height, I learned that an aide-de-camp of the emperor had arrived, and that Prince Joseph had just passed by with the Duc de Feltre, in whose company he had proceeded along the outer boulevard leading to the gate of Mousseau and of the Rue de Roule. I struck off by the inner boulevard in order to gain upon and overtake him at the gate of the Champs-Élysées, but I was too late. Officers of the National Guard informed me that he had taken the direction of the Bois de Boulogne. I was endeavoring in vain to account for his following that road when I was overtaken by a quartermaster of the Parisian Guard who had hastened after me from the suburb of Saint-Antoine. He brought me a letter from one of my private secretaries, who stated that he had just received a pressing letter from me from the High Judge, and that a circumstantial acknowledgment was required of its having come to hand. I hurried home and found an order for me to quit Paris immediately and follow the road taken by the Empress. I was informed that Monsieur de Talleyrand had called 2 hours before, that he had waited for me, and on going away had expressed his intention to return, being desirous of having a conversation with me. On considering the hour at which the letter from the High Judge was dated, I guessed the motive of Monsieur de Talleyrand's visit, as he had remained at home whilst I was proceeding to the different gates. He had received before me the dispatch which enjoined him to quit Paris, and was desirous of conversing with me upon the subject. I was correct in my conjectures. Monsieur de Talleyrand returned almost at the very moment of my arrival at my hotel, and spoke to me of the embarrassment into which he was thrown He did not altogether refuse to quit Paris, although he was not very anxious to remove. He renewed his attacks against those whom he accused as authors of all the misfortunes which were falling upon us, and sincerely pitied the emperor for placing dependence upon these ignorant men who had ruined him. He added, however, that the ill usage he had received from the emperor had entirely destroyed the sentiments of affection which he formerly entertained towards him, nor could he forget his having been sacrificed to a few wretches. He was nevertheless desirous, for the advantage of all, that the edifice should not crumble to pieces, and Paris was the only place where it could be safe from destruction. He requested I would authorize him to remain, persuaded as he was that by so doing I should perform an essential service to the emperor and the whole community. I did not allow myself to be caught by this lure, and replied to the diplomatist that I not only did not authorize his remaining, but enjoined him, as far as it was in my power, to depart immediately and repair to the presence of the empress. I even intimated to him that from the present moment I should watch his departure and adopt measures for compelling him to that course. I accordingly appointed agents to have an eye upon the actions of that personage. He pretended to yield assent to my injunctions, but hastened to solicit from the prefect of police that authority which he failed to obtain for myself. The prefect refused. Monsieur de Talleyrand was compelled to proceed on his way, but took means for having himself stopped on the road and ordered back to Paris. This was certainly an act of prudence on his part, or his plans were not yet matured. What object, in fact, could have been answered by his so perseveringly soliciting an authority to remain in Paris? If his arrangements had been completed, it would have been sufficient for him to keep himself concealed for a few hours, at the end of which he would have found himself in the midst of the Russians. But he was sure of nothing. He dreaded the future, and happen what might, he wished to have an excuse in store for remaining in the capital. He impressed the allies with the conviction that he had it in his power to accomplish the emperor's ruin, and he persuaded his own dupes that the allies hesitated, but that he hoped to conquer their repugnance and restore the Bourbons to the throne. Chapter 2. Monsieur de Talleyrand had no sooner left me than I made every preparation for my own departure. I sent for Monsieur Pasquier, the prefect of police, and after acquainting him with the order given to me, I desired he would remain in Paris, and apprised him of the consequences which I foresaw would necessarily result from a determination I had vainly resisted. I did not conceal from him my apprehension of the extent of the evil, and of the attempt that would be made to subvert the existing government, adding that he would undoubtedly be applied to for his concurrence in such an attempt. I obtained his promise of acting with the utmost circumspection, and of his strictly discharging his public duty, from which a man of honor ought never to deviate. I told him that Monsieur de Chavrol, the prefect of the Seine, in whom the emperor had reposed so much confidence as to entrust him with the administration of Paris on the first approach of the storm, was receiving from the minister of the interior a mission of a nature in all respect analogous to that which I was committing to his own care, that by combining their efforts they might avert serious evils and raise themselves to the highest pinnacle of honor. Monsieur Pasquier was long aware of my private opinion respecting the eventual issue of the contest. I had often communicated to him the extent of my apprehensions, and upon many subjects I had held a very confidential intercourse with him. I congratulated myself in having it in my power to leave him in Paris under existing circumstances, as much out of regard for the consideration which his talents had secured to him, as on account of the reputation he had acquired by his upright character. He replied in such a manner as to confirm me in the exalted opinion I had formed to him. He told me that he entertained no doubt of the existence of many sinister projects, but for his own part he would never appear in any other character than that of a magistrate appointed to preside over the public tranquility. So long as he might be left in authority, he would never wield it but for the attainment of that object. I have never altered my opinion of Monsieur Pasquier, notwithstanding all that has since happened, and I have no doubt that he would have exerted every endeavor to check a popular commotion, but the impulse emanated from too high a source, and he was compelled to follow the stream. So unbounded was my confidence that I committed to his care a portfolio containing all the letters which the emperor had done me the honor to address to me during my administration, being unwilling to expose it to the risk of a plunder to which I might be more particularly subjected in the event of a revolution which I felt to be near at hand. He undertook the charge on condition of his being allowed to consign it to the flames if it should expose him to any personal danger. This apprehended danger having actually occurred, the valuable deposit was accordingly destroyed. I had caused my secret correspondence to be removed and had burnt all the papers that were calculated to compromise those individuals who were attached to my administration, feeling myself bound to relieve from every kind of uneasiness a crowd of persons who had rendered faithful services to me in my official capacity. Ever since the beginning of February, they had remained in the offices of the Ministry of Police. No document that could expose them to the consequences of private revenge or to any other danger. I left in Paris the chief secretary of that department in order that he should retain the charge of the personnel of the administration. And I instructed M. Danglars, who had the superintendence of the district beyond the Alps, to join me at Blois. M. Riel, who was at the head of another district, received a similar intimation. With respect to M. Pellet de la Lozère, who was appointed to the 3rd district, he was performing a mission in the south of France. Every arrangement having been made, I took my departure at the hour of 4:30 in the evening and attempted to proceed by the gate of Savary, but it was so much obstructed by carriages that I determined to pass through Orléans, conceiving that I should meet with no impediment along that road. I was right in my conjecture. At no period of my life was my mind in such a state of agitation as at the moment quitting Paris. I was even tempted at one time to retrace my steps, and was on the point of infringing the direct instructions of the emperor that I should not remain in Paris. The empress should be compelled to take her departure. Nevertheless, when I reflected upon the consequences which might have attended so inexcusable an act of disobedience in the event of affairs taking a different turn from that which I flattered myself I might impart to them, I felt apprehensive of exposing my responsibility to such risks. I was not free from uneasiness respecting M. de Talleyrand, and if I neglected to procure his arrest and force him along with me, the omission is to be ascribed to the circumstance of my having no place at command where I could lodge him safely. I could not be ignorant of the different parts he had acted by turns during the course of the revolution. I was aware of his having served every faction which had successfully obtained possession of power, of his having invariably found himself moored in safe anchorage whenever a storm had burst over our heads, and of his having always sided with the stronger party. I also knew how greatly he must have been disaffected towards the emperor, and how much he had to apprehend from the party which had placed him in so unfavorable a position towards the prince. I could entertain no doubt, therefore, of his seizing upon the earliest opportunity of taking a signal revenge of his enemies, and of securing to himself a position so commanding as to place him beyond the reach of their animosity. The emperor was still more alive than I was to these various circumstances. He had, besides, near his person, M. de Bassano, who was assuredly not friendly to M. de Talleyrand, and who was well acquainted with his character under every point of view. So far, however, from issuing any orders against him, he gave strict injunctions that he should not be molested, and allowed him to sit in the Council of Regency. It must be acknowledged at the same time that the sentiments which he manifested until the last moment were far from justifying any measures of severity. Why did the emperor retain him in his service, notwithstanding the warnings he had received of M. de Talleyrand's underhand maneuvers? Because he was acquainted with circumstances in his previous conduct which could not but be a check to the plans of revenge which he meditated, and because the recollection of his early services was not entirely obliterated. The emperor was never known to forget the services rendered to him, and he never wholly deserted a man who had at any time given him satisfaction. Word even, but on a solitary occasion. He often scolded or gave severe reproofs, but almost instantly forgot what had passed. His moments of ill humor generally proceeded from a report made to him, which had sometimes no connection whatever with the ground of reprimand. I have frequently heard him assert that M. de Talleyrand had his fair side, that he had given more pledges than any other man against his taking part in any rising in favor of the House of Bourbon. And I have always been persuaded that this consideration had alone prevented the emperor from dismissing him altogether from his counsels, a course which was constantly recommended to him. The previous proceedings of that diplomatist appeared, in fact, to afford a sufficient pledge for his future conduct. Monsieur de Talleyrand was one of the members of the Constituent Assembly who had been most violent in attacking the court of Versailles at a later period. He relied upon his public and avowed acts to win the confidence of the Directory, under whom he served in the capacity of Minister for Foreign Affairs. On the return from Egypt, he was one of those who contributed most powerfully to the overthrow of the Directory and to the dispersion of the party who labored to call the Duke of Orleans, or in default the Duke, a Spanish prince, to the throne of France. On the occasion of the trial of George Cadoudal and his accomplices in the year 1804, he was a person who pointed out the Duc d'Enghien as the only one answering to the description of the individual alluded to by two of Cadoudal's agents in their depositions. See the particulars of that event in the second part of the first volume. He fixed the determination adopted in regard to that prince by remarking that the individual pointed out could be no other than a prince of the House of Bourbon, because the Bourbons were alone interested in preventing the revolutionary party from taking advantage of the blow meditated by Cadoudal on his visit to France. He drew attention to the circumstances that of all the princes of the House of Bourbon, the Duc d'Enghien was the only one whose firmness of character and whose peculiar place of residence could give countenance to the suspicions created by the depositions of George's companions. He supported his individual opinion by details which he had derived from the correspondence of certain agents of his own department, and caused that measure to be adopted which was eventually carried into effect. He was almost the only person in France who was in on the secret, and who perhaps knew, or had at least the means of foretelling, the issue of the measure. He wrote to the diplomatic envoys at the courts of the several princes on the right bank of the Rhine for the purpose of justifying the violation of their territory. I admit that this formality was enjoined to him by the nature of his office, but it must also be admitted that he displayed a remarkable degree of reserve on the occasion, since a single expression dropped in the saloon of the Hôtel de Luna, where he was on terms of constant intercourse at the time, would have been sufficient to defeat the object in view. The first consul, who was not even aware of the existence of a Duc d'Enghien, saw nothing more in Monsieur de Talleyrand's exertions on the occasion than an active attachment to his person, since the only object of Cadoudal and his accomplices was to take away his life. And in the zeal which he displayed in prosecuting them, the minister could contemplate nothing else in delivering up to the sword of justice all those who had taken a part in the attempt. The Duc d'Enghien was not the heir to the crown. Under no circumstances could he have been called to it, and the emperor could derive no personal advantage from putting him to death. He was even ignorant of his proximity to Strasbourg. The police was not better informed on the subject, for its system did not possess at that time the extensive ramifications which it acquired at a later period. Whatever took place beyond the frontiers was exclusively watched, reported, and followed up by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The part taken by Monsieur de Talleyrand in that business greatly contributed to protect him from the attacks of his enemies, who were endeavoring to represent him as an agent of the House of Bourbon. The emperor, who was much displeased at the incorrect information given to him on this occasion, never allowed the least expression of blame to escape him against anyone. He was not unmindful of the intention manifested to serve him, but he also treasured up a recollection of the errors committed by those who had been actuated by zeal for his service, and he did so for the purpose of avoiding similar mistakes on future occasions. Independently of this feature of Monsieur de Talleyrand's conduct, which might well be set down in the account of Monsieur de Talleyrand's, afforded several other guarantees for his fidelity. He had been the principal agent in the plan of dethroning the Neapolitan Bourbons in the year 1805. And lastly, it was he who proposed the dethroning of the Spanish branch of that family, a measure prepared long beforehand. His own partisans pretend that he was a perfect stranger to the latter plan, but nothing is more required than mere common sense to discover that a treaty by which such mighty interests were disposed of could never have been decided in a day, and that previously to regulating the indemnities to be given to those whose political existence must sink in consequence of the changes meditated in Spain, many negotiations must have been carried on, especially as the question had never been discussed in written communications, but had been treated between the Prince of the Peace and Monsieur de Talleyrand through the channel of Izquierdo, the confidential agent of the Spanish minister. The document I have quoted in the second part of the volume 2 is moreover a clear proof that the negotiation was followed up by Monsieur de Talleyrand himself. He it was who demanded the cession of territory and insisted upon a change in the order of succession. This, however, was not the only part he took in that business. He was not only the person who followed it up, but I have no hesitation in affirming that he gave the first idea of it. After the Battle of Friedland, the Emperor had entrusted me with the command of Königsberg and all Prussian proper. Previously to that battle, Monsieur de Talleyrand had repaired to Danzig in order to await the issue of events and the instructions to the Emperor, who wrote from Tilsit to desire he would take up his residence at Königsberg. He had scarcely reached the latter place when a courier brought him a letter from the Emperor. I had also received a dispatch by which the Prince ordered me to get in readiness a pontoon train, which was in the arsenal of the town, and to send it forward by the canal so that it might reach Tilsit without loss of time. I communicated my orders to Monsieur de Talleyrand, who showed me the letter he had received. The Emperor informed him that Alexander had solicited an armistice for a few days. He had granted it. Alexander had afterwards proposed an interview, which he was not over anxious to accede to. He had not yet made up his mind, but would consider the proposal, and a peace was not immediately concluded. His determination was formed to cross the Niemen without farther delay. He was the more inclined to this course, as the Russians had no longer any army, whilst 2/3 of his own forces had not been engaged on the field of battle at Friedland. He concluded by directing Monsieur Talleyrand to join him. The Emperor's statement was correct. Only 3 corps had been engaged at Friedland, with a single division of cuirassiers, independently of the dragoons and light cavalry, having been charged with the management of the affairs of France at the court of Russia. After the conclusion of peace, I traveled from Tilsit to St. Petersburg with several corps of the Russian Guard, and the officers I met and conversed with admitted that, independently of the Guard, they had, properly speaking, no army left to them, according to a calculation in which we mutually agreed the Emperor of Russia could not have opposed to us a larger force of 22,000 men of regular troops. We should have crossed the Niemen, a movement the Emperor could easily effect, having upwards of 150,000 men in his command. We were only the 20th or 22nd of June, and Poland was mad for an insurrection. During my stay in Russia, I often had occasion to satisfy myself that these were the considerations which had determined the Emperor Alexander to solicit the celebrated interview on the raft Tilsit. On receiving the order to repair to Tilsit and observing what the Emperor stated in the letter which he wrote to me, Monsieur de Talleyrand accelerated his departure as much as possible, saying to me, "Be in no hurry to send off your bridge. I trust the Emperor will have no occasion for it. What could he have to do beyond the Niemen? We must take him to renounce his idea respecting Poland. Nothing is to be done with those people. With the Poles, no organization can be imparted to anything else but disorder. An opportunity now offers for honorably concluding all matters. It must be laid hold of, and with the greater speed, as the Emperor is called away to an affair of much higher importance in another quarter, which he has the means of introducing into a treaty of peace. Should he neglect this course, whenever he may embark in the affair, he will be called back to this spot by fresh embarrassments, whereas he may this very day bring everything to a close, the rather so as the plan which he meditates is a rational consequence of his system. How could it be, in fact, supposed that Monsieur de Talleyrand was a stranger to the affairs of Spain, supposing even that he had contemplated to betray the Emperor by prevailing upon him to enter into those terms of peace which were concluded at Tilsit? He had not to deal with a madman. The Emperor was fully aware of the condition of the Russian forces. Nothing remained of the Prussian army but the recollection of it, whilst our own army might almost be said to be unbroken. In this state of things, what could prevent the Emperor from carrying into effect any plans he might have meditated? It was nevertheless Monsieur de Talleyrand's intention to divert him from the idea of crossing the Niemen and restoring the kingdom of Poland. It followed as a necessary consequence that he must have explained to him his reasons for so doing. And since it was attended to and peace was concluded, how can it be taken for granted that M. de Talleyrand should have neglected to urge upon him the advantage of entering into the explanation with the Emperor Alexander in respect to his ulterior views at a moment when he might have obtained the acquiescence of that prince in whatever he proposed? This admission is still more impossible when it is borne in mind that he was fully sensible of the necessity of Alexander's concurrence in order to prevent a renewal of the war. The most limited understanding will readily perceive that it would have been the height of folly in the emperor to renounce the immense advantages he had derived from the war and embark on an enterprise such as that upon Spain without coming to an understanding with the Emperor of Russia, who might return to arms as soon as we have withdrawn our troops and enter into an alliance with Austria, who was no party to what was agreed upon at Tilsit. Had the peace which was signed on that occasion rested upon any other basis than those upon which it was actually concluded, it might then be alleged that Russia was a total stranger to the affairs of Spain. In her then powerless state, her monarch came in person to treat at the emperor's headquarters, and when, instead of being required to make sacrifices, he divided with us the spoils of the vanquished, nothing short of insanity could have prevented our bestowing attention to the views which he meditated, and have thus rendered their success problematical by neglecting to give an interest in them to the only power which could obstruct their accomplishment. So far from suffering any loss of territory, the Emperor of Russia obtained that the states of his father-in-law, the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, which had been invaded, should be restored to him. He interceded in behalf of his ally, the King of Prussia, and succeeded so effectually that Frederick William was reinstated in the possession of a portion of the provinces wrested from him. With respect to the Emperor of Russia himself, he obtained the grant of a district of which was taken from the territory of that prince. We rendered him a still more effectual service. We stipulated nothing on behalf of the Turks, who had lost Wallachia and Moldavia by arming in our favor. It would have been easy for us to include them in the treaty we were concluding. We had on our side the right of the strongest and that of justice, both which would have fully justified us in stipulating for our allies, as the Russians were doing on behalf of their own friends. Unquestionably, these several transactions did not take place without our receiving some compensation from Emperor Alexander, who, having nothing of his own to bestow, felt it incumbent upon him to give his countenance to our views. Had not this been the case, we should have been left without an excuse for abandoning the Turks to their fate. I could only account to myself for the conduct which we adopted on this occasion from what Alexander did me the honor to communicate to me in the conversations he had held with the emperor respecting Turkey and their future views with regard to that country. I have no doubt that matters would not have been arranged altogether in the manner anticipated by the Emperor of Russia, but I was not provided with any instructions on the subject. He no doubt announced certain views which he meditated upon Turkey. The emperor, on the other hand, could not have failed to speak of his own views upon Spain with that reserve, however, which sovereigns are wont to impart to their mutual intercourse. It is impossible to suppose, even if the terms of reciprocal confidence were not of an unbounded nature, that Alexander was ignorant of the emperor's projects upon Spain. Had the question been one of mere arrangement of differences, we should not have allowed the Russians to take those advantages over our allies which we actually gave up to them. On the other hand, it would have answered no object whatever to deceive the Russian autocrat in regard to the intentions entertained respecting the Spanish peninsula. He could never have been the dupe of such an artifice. He was aware that the Spanish royal family had inherited all the rights of Philip V, and that so long as his descendants should sway the scepter, the work of the French Revolution could possess no stability. He knew that the enterprising acts of a warlike prince, whom chance might call to the throne of Spain, would be sufficient to place everything in jeopardy. Does not history tell us that when Louis XV in his infancy was attacked with the smallpox, King Philip V fancied that the danger of his nephew was designedly kept from his knowledge and prepared to return to France for the purpose of asserting his right to the crown? I think I have demonstrated the improbability of Russia having been kept in ignorance of the changes meditated in Spain. M. de Talleyrand, therefore, could not but have been aware of them. The contrary supposition must lead to the interference appearance, the inference that he had acted a sorry part at Tilsit, a complaint which has never been laid to his charge. Chapter 3. The following fact may also be adduced in support of my assertion that conscription raised after the Battle of Eylau furnished the portion of troops destined to compose the corps, which advanced towards the Adour and the province of Roussillon in the course of the following summer. The direction thus given to them sufficiently pointed out what was to be their ulterior destination. Now I ask, what individual in the French Empire could possibly have demonstrated the necessity of such an expedition? Who could have given a warning of the dangers which might at some future day threaten that part of our frontiers? Who else but the Minister for Foreign Affairs? What could have given the Emperor an account of the secret dispositions of the Prince of the Peace? Who could have laid before him the proclamation addressed to the Spaniards by that favorite? Assuredly no one else but the Minister for Foreign Affairs. One more observation before I conclude. What are the grounds of the Treaty of Fontainebleau? The unfavorable notions furnished at different times by the Prince of the Peace respecting the hostile intentions of the Prince of Asturias towards France? That wretched man who sought to secure a position for himself which would protect him from the threatened vengeance of the heir to the crown earnestly urged the attention of the cabinet of the Tuileries to the plots which Ferdinand was unceasingly hatching against King Charles IV, his father. He announced that if there was any farther hesitation in taking a part against that prince or some measure with respect to the kingdom, he could answer for nothing. That the first consequence of the accession of the Prince of Asturias to the throne would be a change in the policy of Spain. In the interval between these communications and the conclusion of such a treaty as that of Fontainebleau, many proposals and replies to them must necessarily have intervened. However daring a minister may be, a great distance must be measured previously to consenting or even proposing to deliver up his masters, or at least to his abusing the confidence which they have reposed in him, by frightening them at first respecting the danger into which he had drawn them, and afterwards inducing them to withdraw to their American possessions in order that he might the more freely receive the price of his treachery. For, in short, the Prince of the Peace had undertaken to prevail upon King Charles IV to remove to Mexico with his family, in imitation of the Prince of Portugal, who had left Europe for the Brazils. His intention was to accompany him as far as Seville, secretly desert him at that place, and proceed to assume possession of the Algarve as his own principality. It was in fact the proposal which he made at the Council of Aranjuez to abandon Spain and retire to Mexico, which decided the movement of which the Prince of Asturias took the lead.